Hi everyone. My name's Adrian Short, and I am Vice Chairman of the Myanmar-Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce in Myanmar here. We're calling you here from Myanmar today. I think we've got quite a number of participants already in, and in the interest of time, I would like to maybe we start the conference, the webinar now. So without much ado, I would just like to introduce our speaker today, which is Julia Charlton, who's managing partner of Charlton's law firm. Julia was admitted as a solicitor in England and Wales in 1985 and has practiced as a solicitor in Hong Kong since 1987. And during that time, she's been named a leading lawyer by Asia Law and Practice for the years 2002 through to 2018. Among other office positions she holds, Julia is currently a member of the Takeovers panel and the Takeovers appeals panel of the Hong Kong SFC. Julia's firm has been in operation in Yangon since 2013, and Julia herself has advised on restructurings, fundraisings, and M&A in Myanmar. And so I can't think of anybody better placed to conduct this seminar today. We had the pleasure of having Julia do a previous seminar for us, and that was to cover COVID-19 pandemics and the impact on labour-intensive industry in Myanmar. This has already been published on our Facebook page, so if anybody wants to go and have a look at the outcome from that, then you're more than welcome to visit that and replay that whole session. Julie will touch upon those areas in this, but the main purpose and thrust of this is to look at the new insolvency law in Myanmar and also the new industrial zones law. These are recent laws that have been introduced this year, and so it's very relevant that we are able to discuss those today. Some of you may not know, but according to DICA, Hong Kong is now the biggest investor for the last 7 months into Myanmar. And so it's very good that we are able to have an open conversation so that people who are looking to invest can understand how to go about it and what are the latest requirements and opportunities for businesses to enter into the Myanmar market. So without further ado, I will hand over to Julia. But first, in terms of the format for today, Julia will go through a presentation. We would like you, if possible, to ask questions through the chat, and we will go through those questions at the end of the session. We hope to leave about 15 minutes or so that we can go through each of those questions in turn. I will seek to moderate, because if we have too many questions, we obviously want to try and get through them as much as we can. Any we can't answer or can't get to, we will endeavour to answer through our MHKCCI websites, Facebook pages, and other social media sections. So without any further ado, maybe I could hand over to you, Julia, for this whole session. And thank you for joining us and leading us on this call.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So following on the Chamber's webinar a few weeks ago on the impact of COVID-19 on labour-intensive industries, which I participated in, I'm going to give you an update on how these industries are coping. I know we're all pretty sick of talking about COVID, which is quite unbelievable when you consider the massive impact of it. But I think we're all kind of COVIDed it out, but I will go through that as quickly as I can. And then, as Adrian mentioned, I'll talk about insolvency and the industrial zone law and one or two other recent developments. So I'm going to focus on just an update on the COVID-19 labour-intensive industries and what's going on with them. And as we know, there's been government relief measures aimed at lessening the impact of the pandemic and the general position in terms of investment in Myanmar, cross-border and regional trade, e-commerce, external financial support, and the business environment. So let me move on to the next part of this. So according to the World Bank's latest report in June, which is a very interesting document on Myanmar, it says that Myanmar has been hard hit with economic growth for this year, expected to show a sharp decline to 0.5%. But that's still growth, it's growth. So this is due primarily to the company's exposure to COVID and the reduced growth in China in particular, since China accounts for 33% of Myanmar's exports. And restrictions on travel, cross-border trade have impacted Myanmar's tourism industry and related services and agricultural exports, which make up about half of the Myanmar's total exports, or 4% of GDP. Supply chains have also been disrupted, particularly in the garment industry, which accounts for 13% of the country's exports. The labour market's been affected. Around 78% of Myanmar's rural workforce is employed in agriculture, while around 27% of the urban workforce works in tourism and related services, areas which have been significantly affected by COVID. But the prospects are less bleak than in many developed economies, and the World Bank is expecting Myanmar's economic growth to recover to very positive territory in 2020-21 and to return to trend in the medium term, supported by investment in infrastructure, power, property markets, strong exports, and resilient domestic consumption, which accounts for 50% of GDP. In fact, the World Bank is now predicting that Myanmar will be in the 10% of world economies not to go into recession this year. The other 90% they're predicting will be in recession. Other positives to highlight: travel infrastructure projects, which are in progress, facilitated by a new project bank, are still going on. There's a boost to the service sector provided by the licensing of foreign insurers to operate in Myanmar, and that's a bright spot, allowing foreign banks also to provide wholesale and retail lending in the country. But as in many places, COVID is expected to continue to disproportionately affect the poor. 68% of Myanmar's poor work in agriculture, and they're vulnerable given the reduced output and prices due to declines in exports to China. Household incomes are likely to be affected by redundancies in the manufacturing sector, which employs 500,000 people. High inflation and potentially higher food prices are also likely to disproportionately hit the poorest sectors of the population. In terms of factory reopenings, most companies, shops and restaurants in Yangon, Mandalay and Naypyidaw resumed operations at the beginning of June after 2 weeks of no local transmissions. Bus companies, as we know, have also been allowed to resume operations if they implement guidelines on COVID preventative measures, and government employees returned to their offices also on the 1st of June after being required to stay home for a while. Other regions reopened earlier. Around 175 workshops and factories in the Sargang region reopened in mid-May. Over 1,000 factories employing around 20,000 workers in the Magwe region reopened at the end of May after the regional government's conduct of inspections. As of around the 13th of June, 2 weeks after major businesses in Myanmar reopened, Myanmar reported 25 new COVID cases, including 2 locally transmitted cases, bringing the official total to 261. As elsewhere, Myanmar businesses are resuming operations out of economic necessity. The impact of COVID on Myanmar's economy is evident in the fall in the manufacturing PMI to 29 in April 2020, its lowest level since the index began in December 2015, and down from 45.3 in March. But the latest figures show an increase in the PMI to 48.7 in June 2020, which is being taken as a sign that the most extreme phase of disruption to Myanmar's manufacturing sector has passed, with output and new orders rising for the first time in 4 months. However, workers are bearing the brunt of measures to reopen the economy, with reports of insufficiently ventilated workplaces and employers failing to provide hand-washing facilities. Local press reports point to failings in corporate conduct, hostility to trade unions, which would enable workers to obtain greater protection, and perceived failings in the social security system. There are reports of employers not paying wages or paying salaries, which leave employees struggling to meet basic living costs. A number of global brands, including H&M, Inditex and Next, are backing an initiative to implement health and safety protection measures for workers in Myanmar garment factories under a framework for action in collaboration with the Industrial Workers Union Federation of Myanmar. And the initiative aims to benefit around 100,000 garment workers and will also work with relevant organizations to fund compensations of workers' wages lost between April and July. In terms of employee benefits, I mean, we probably all remember that Myanmar established a social security fund back in 2012, and that was intended to provide a safety net for workers during times of crisis. And while the government can't be blamed for not anticipating the current crisis triggered by COVID, the fund has really proved inadequate to protect Myanmar's factory workers. But the government has pledged to pay contributing workers 40% of their salaries if factories are closed. But in practice, many factory workers aren't registered, sometimes because they don't have social security numbers or their employers haven't paid their contributions. Many factory workers have apparently received nothing as a result. Another issue is that despite a pledge by the Central Committee on Prevention, Control and Treatment of COVID to provide food to those with irregular income, factory workers, including those who were dismissed, are not included in the definition of people with irregular income. In terms of loans, as we know, in late March, the government launched various measures to assist businesses. For example, a COVID-19 fund for SMEs and textile and tourism businesses to provide loans at a 1% interest rate. But only a fraction of companies have received loans, around 1/6 of those who've applied, as I understand it. And the total government lending to businesses impacted by COVID was stood at around 28 billion chats, about $20 million at the beginning of June. Businesses have also faced difficulties in availing themselves of the government policies. A number of businesses report being denied access to programs or finding the application procedures too hard. Most businesses haven't benefited from the relief measures. And just anecdotally, I would mention that includes some of the businesses that we're advising who are our clients. These problems suggest that the government could take steps to increase awareness of relief measures, simplify the application process, and train staff to ensure policies and schemes are made available in a transparent and consistent manner. But the good news, despite the pandemic, investment into Myanmar has continued. Since the first cases of COVID were identified in March, approval for the investment of around $8 million in total has been granted to 3 companies based in China and Hong Kong, and to 1 Myanmar company. The investments will be made in Yangon and are expected to be operational within a year and to create around 656 new jobs. These are not large numbers, but it is something. There's been strong foreign investor interest in Myanmar's garment manufacturing sector, despite a significant drop in garment export volumes to $2.7 billion between the 1st of October last year and the 31st of May this year, which was a $24 million fall compared to the same period in the previous year, when you would have expected growth. Hong Kong provided 32% of approved FDI into Myanmar in the first 7 months of the 2019-2020 fiscal year. Approved Hong Kong investments included investments in electricity and power, garment manufacturing, and property development. And commentators have noted that FDI commitments to Myanmar should rise as the country's energy, infrastructure, and manufacturing requirements expand to meet higher demand. Hong Kong investors are attracted to Myanmar's garment industry by the trade privileges, particularly the 12.5% tax break on Myanmar finished garments exported to European markets under the EU Generalised Scheme of Preferences. You may know that many Hong Kong families have got, long history of and background of investment in the garment sector, and it's a source of wealth of quite a proportion of Hong Kong's entrepreneurial families historically. China's a major investor in Myanmar, of course, as we know, with FDI of $21 billion as of March 2020. The Belt and Road Initiative projects in Myanmar include the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, which will connect the Indian Ocean oil trade to China's Yunnan province, trying to address the issues in China's oil supply. And there's discussions also in progress on developing China's other Myanmar projects in the context of Myanmar's COVID economic relief plan, including the new Yangon city, a deep sea port and industrial zone, and the China-Myanmar cross-border economic zone cooperation zone projects. It's also interesting that further to this goal 2 of the COVID-19 economic relief plan, which was reducing the impact on the private sector by promoting investment, trade and banking enterprises, the government issued a union taxation law ordinance on the 12th of June, just about 3 weeks ago, providing a number of tax exemptions to take effect for the 2020-21 tax year. The 4 main exemptions are a non-refundable tax credit on 10% of total additional wages and salaries paid in the 2019-2020 income year, deduction from income classified as expenditure equivalent to 125% of total additional wages and salaries paid in the 2019 to 2020 income year as compared with the previous year, and non-refundable tax credit equal to 10% of the total value of additional capital equipment input made in the current financial year. which is not available to businesses already subject to tax exemptions or relief under the Myanmar Investment Law or the Special Economic Zone Law, and a one-time depreciation on the value of capital equipment equivalent to 125% of the usual reduction value for the current financial year. These exemptions should go some way in promoting continuing investment and trade for companies that are facing financial difficulties. I would also note that Myanmar's Ministry of Investment and Foreign Economic Relations finished their second investment policy review at the end of June. It's apparently going to be published in the next 3 months. And the review focused on identifying investment policies that need to be improved in order to attract more investment. COVID has significantly impacted Myanmar's cross-border trade with China, which dropped by 160 million US in the first 8 months of this year, compared to the same period last fiscal year. There was $2 billion US worth of goods imported into Myanmar between the end of October last year and the 15th of May this year. Myanmar and China have been discussing the negative impact of border restrictions on Myanmar's seafood and fruit industries, and the Myanmar government is keen to accelerate the flow of perishable goods across the border to reduce exporters' losses. And Myanmar and Beijing have also been working to speed up the provision of Myanmar exports to Chinese customers. In relation to regional trade, ASEAN leaders agreed to implement a coordinated response to mitigating the economic impact of COVID at a meeting on the 4th of June through facilitating import and export processes in the region and strengthening regional supply chains to maintain the flow of goods and services. Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines have offered to buy rice produced in Myanmar, and apparently the crops are holding up very well. ASEAN countries increasing their rice stock also offers Myanmar an opportunity to negotiate long-term export contracts with their neighbours. And Myanmar expects to export about 2.5 million tonnes of rice in the current financial year and has seen exports of 1.8 million tonnes up to the 15th of May, earning more than $542 million US. In terms of external support, the Japan International Cooperation Agency announced emergency loans equivalent to around $45.75 million US on the 1st of June to assist businesses in Myanmar impacted by COVID. These loans are low interest bearing with 1 to 5 year maturities to support SMEs continuing operations. Loans will be provided by Myanmar Economic Bank and other commercial banks for working capital and fixed asset investments. The IMF approved $356 million US of emergency assistance on the 26th of June, which had been requested by Myanmar to assist it in minimizing the impact of COVID by stimulating the economy and to support spending on health and social safety. The assistance is being provided under the IMF's Rapid Credit Facility and Rapid Financing Instrument Program. Initial estimates of Myanmar's budget deficit predicted a deficit of nearly 7 billion kyats, but that figure is now expected to grow by 2,000 to 3,000 more billion kyats due to the decline in GDP growth in the upcoming fiscal year. On the 27th of May, Myanmar's parliament approved borrowing 1.3 trillion kyats, around $925 million US, from the Central Bank of Myanmar to cover budget deficits. And that's expected to fund around 20% of the total deficit, apparently. E-commerce, very important at the current times. Myanmar's Ministry of Commerce, as I think I mentioned in the last talk I gave, announced in May that it will launch a central e-commerce website to promote the use of digital platforms to promote economic growth. And the e-commerce website will allow businesses to sell products online and is expected to be launched by the end of the year. All payments on the website will be made by bank transfers, mobile payments, or card payments. And Myanmar's CERP also commits to promoting digital and mobile platforms for payments and retail trade. Around 2/3 of Myanmar businesses are facing cash flow problems and struggling to survive. In early June, Myanmar's Hotel and Tourism Ministry said that it expected Myanmar's tourism sector to reopen once it begins implementing stage 3 of the ministry's strategic roadmap for reopening. However, some tourist locations have reopened for domestic tourism. Hotels in South Shan State have been given the go-ahead to receive visitors by regional tourism authorities after implementing COVID preventative measures. with 34 out of 58 hotels in Kalor back in normal operation. In another state, it's also reopened for domestic tourists, except visitors from Yangon townships, which have high COVID rates. As of the 1st of June, the government had lent 7 billion chats to 168 hotels and over 1 billion chats to tourism-related businesses and 1 billion chats to 58 restaurants. In this month, the overall figure had already risen to more than 21 billion chats, or around 15.5 million US dollars. So that's a sort of overview of, I think, where we may have got to with COVID, but obviously things change by the week at the moment. And I'm going to turn now to talking about something which was actually extremely timely in one way, because it came into effect very recently, and that's the new and actually extremely impressive insolvency law which Myanmar has enacted. This was recent, and it was implemented. It's called the Unified Insolvency Law 2020, and it covers personal and corporate insolvency and cross-border insolvency, although that bit hasn't come into force yet. The new law came into force on the 25th of March, except for the cross-border bit, which will come in at a date to be notified. And there's also some extremely voluminous insolvency rules 2020 supplementing the new law, which were published on the 28th of April. The new law repeals the Yangon Insolvency Act of, would you believe it, 1909, and the Myanmar Insolvency Act 1920. Amazing that they were so well written that they managed to last 100 years, and also overrides the provisions of company law winding up included in the Myanmar Companies Law 2017, well, in relation to insolvent winding up in any event. The new law was developed in partnership with the ADB, and I'll just go through some key aspects. So there's an introduction of a corporate rescue and rehabilitation process as an alternative to liquidation. The idea being, let's give companies a breathing space. Let's try and help them recover rather than just pushing them straight into liquidation. There's provisions allowing individuals facing insolvency to enter into voluntary arrangements with their creditors, providing for part of the debt to be written off or for payments over a fixed period, usually with no interest. And as I mentioned, although not yet in force, the adoption of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law's model law on cross-border insolvency for distressed companies that have creditors or assets in more than one jurisdiction. This development is likely to be of particular interest to foreign investors in Myanmar. Given the financial pressures facing companies and small and medium-sized enterprises, in particular in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the new insolvency law is likely to be a welcome development. Although I'll mention a bit later that perhaps the government, as in other places, could have done something a bit differently at that point. But anyway, that does not minimize how welcome this new law is. So in terms of corporate rescue and rehabilitation, the new law's corporate rescue and rehabilitation mechanism has been created to cater for Myanmar's developing economy, and it seeks to offer companies facing financial distress an alternative to liquidation and aims to safeguard companies' existence as a going concern, or if this can't be achieved, to rescue as much of the business as possible. So the law introduces a two-stage process. The first is the rescue stage, during which an insolvency practitioner is appointed as the rehabilitation manager to manage a company and explore the options for the company's rehabilitation with the company's creditors. The rehabilitation manager is responsible for preparing the rehabilitation plan to submit the creditor's approval. In formulating the plan, the rehabilitation manager has to assess its viability and the likely return to creditors and ensure that the company's associates aren't given an advantage over the company's other creditors. Protections included in the new insolvency law for companies subject to a corporate rescue are that the security can't be enforced against the company without the leave of the court or the rehabilitation manager's written consent, and no proceedings can be brought or continued against the company or its guarantor except with the leave of the court. A creditor's voluntary winding up will be implemented if creditors do not agree to implement a rehabilitation plan or terminate a rehabilitation plan, or if a plan isn't executed within a specified time frame. The company's creditors or a court may also resolve to wind up the company. The new insolvency law also creates a very special separate procedure for the rescue and rehabilitation of micro and small to medium enterprises, MSMEs, which are the backbone of the Myanmar economy. Both incorporated and unincorporated MSMEs are eligible for the MSME Rescue and Rehabilitation Plan if their business debts are below 10 million chats in the case of incorporated MSMEs, or below 1 million Myanmar chats for unincorporated MSMEs. The MSE rescue and rehabilitation process is similar to the corporate rescue and rehabilitation process in that it comprises a rescue stage and enterprise plan stage, although the process is simpler and cheaper. The MSME rescue package also has the same aims and provides the same protections as the corporate rescue process. However, there are some fundamental differences between the two. In particular, the MSME rescue procedure involves the appointment of a rehabilitation advisor rather than a rehabilitation by another interested party. In the case of MSMEs, it will be prepared by the MSME or the rehabilitation advisor with the MSME's consent. And during the rescue stage for corporates, all directors' powers cease unless the rehabilitation manager sanctions their exercise. In the case of MSMEs, the powers of the directors, proprietors, or partners continue. In terms of personal insolvency, the new law creates a clearer process for bankruptcy proceedings. A creditor owed 1 million chats or more can issue a bankruptcy notice against an individual. If the debt isn't repaid within 21 days, the creditor can present a petition for bankruptcy to the courts. In terms of cross-border insolvency, Part 10 of the new insolvency law adopts the principles of the Cont'd model law on cross-border insolvency, which streamlines the process for representatives in offshore insolvency proceedings to be recognized by and obtain relief from the Myanmar courts. The significance of the adoption of the model law is that it should make Myanmar more attractive to foreign investors because it should strengthen cooperation between courts on cross-border insolvency matters. In particular, the value of debtors' assets should be given some protection. So the new insolvency law really is a significant step for Myanmar in enhancing its attractiveness to international investors, which should help to develop the market economy and discourage the use of informal channels for debt recovery. It's hoped that the rescue and rehabilitation process will enable Myanmar to raise its ranking in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report, one of the criteria for which is the ease of resolving insolvency in terms of time, cost, outcome, and recovery rate for commercial insolvency and the strength of the legal framework. In the 2020 report, Myanmar ranked 165th out of 190, which was up 6 places from the preceding year. Further focus on capacity building is likely to be necessary given the lack of experienced insolvency practitioners and the government's commitment to continued commercial law reform. By way of comparison, it's interesting just to have a quick look at the position in India and Pakistan. In relation to India, prior to the pandemic, India was already seeing a surge in insolvency cases, increasing by 30% between October and December last year, and by 123% for last year as a whole, with a total of 3,312 companies admitted for insolvency resolution, of which around 1/3 were manufacturing companies, which is interesting given that the government have been offering more policy support to the sector. In the light of COVID, and in addition to economic measures announced by the Indian Ministry of Finance to support businesses, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Amendments Ordinance was promulgated on the 5th of June, and it introduced a number of amendments to the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code in India, which took immediate effect, and it was to give more breathing space for Indian businesses hit by the pandemic. In particular, the amendments included restrictions on the filing of any application for initiation of corporate insolvency resolution processes of a corporate debtor for any default after the 25th of March 2020 for a period of 6 months, or possibly longer, subject to further notification, and the insertion of a non obstante clause to give protection to directors of a corporate debtor. I'm mentioning this as there's no comparable suspension at the current time of the insolvency law in Myanmar. But as it's just come into force in any event, I don't think it has been much used up to now. In terms of the implications of the amendments in India, it would seem that the out-of-court restructuring regime under the Prudential Framework for Resolution of Stressed Assets will come into focus. And where the restructuring is unfeasible for companies, the lenders would have to rely on applicable recovery and enforcement tools. And the winding up procedure under the Companies Act and voluntary liquidation under the IBC would continue to be available. Just also mentioning Pakistan, not so much the law, but according to a Pakistan economic survey, Pakistan's debt is set to rise to 88% of GDP. And I just want to share a couple of on-the-ground examples of the current difficulties they're facing, which perhaps put some of Myanmar's difficulties into perspective. For example, Pakistan International Airlines stated that losses and debt have become too much for the company to handle, losses of $3 billion at the end of 2019, and it's been suggested the government will have to enter into restructure and bail out, including a debt-to-equity swap and a long-term bond issue to bail out the national carrier. Meanwhile, the University of Engineering and Technology in Pakistan went bankrupt early this month, with the university vice-chancellor saying that they informed the government numerous times of the condition of the university's finances, but nothing was done. And that followed the Pakistan government's move to cut higher education funding by 19% in the current year budget, which, in the words of a Pakistani academic, is indicative of the funding for higher education going from boom in 2002 to 2008 to bust. So none of that is happening in Myanmar that I can see. So that's just to put things in perspective. And moving now to something else, which I think is very positive, and that is the new industrial zone law in Myanmar. And this was enacted on the 26th of May with the aim of promoting industrialization, creating job opportunities, attracting more foreign investment, and increasing the number of products manufactured with domestic raw materials. This is Myanmar's first law on industrial zones. I mean, there are laws on special economic zones, and seeks to realize the government's goal of increasing the industrial sector's contribution to GDP to 37% by 2030. In 2018, industrials accounted for 32% of GDP and 18% of employment. Industrials are expected to contribute 33% to GDP in the current financial year, and the World Bank expects overall industrial growth. Well, they did expect it to reach 9.6% for 2018-2019. But clearly, there won't be much of I think none of the aims for this year will actually be met. I don't think there will be any the previously expected increase in manufacturing and construction activity that they had been planning when they conceived this law. So looking briefly at Myanmar's manufacturing sector, which accounted for around 3/4 of the industrial sector in 2018 to 2019, manufacturing output grew from 10% in 2017 to 10.2% in the 2018-2019 financial year. And it was the third largest sector in terms of FDI value, but that was behind oil and gas and power. But the sector has been adversely impacted by the Chat's depreciation, although actually right now the Chat is doing quite well, as we all know, and inflation in recent years, although a shift towards higher value added production has been driving growth. Comparatively, Myanmar still relies heavily on agriculture, which at the moment is actually quite a bright spot in the economy. The sector provides 49% of employment, 78% in rural areas, and the World Bank predicts that agricultural sector growth should average 4.6% in the medium term. Agriculture's contribution to GDP reduced from 40% in 2010 to 26% by 2018 through the expansion of other sectors, originally estimated to be 24% for this year, but possibly larger given the reducing size of the other sectors. So in terms of the development of the industrial sector, that includes mining, energy, manufacturing and processing, electric power and construction and industry. and it's benefited from this period of relatively good economic growth and increasingly welcoming environment for foreign investment and the recent regulatory reforms. So the growth in Myanmar's industrial sector can be attributed to its low labor costs, still around $3 per day, being the lowest in the region, rising domestic demand and economic zone incentives. There's a pressure on Myanmar industry, which is faced from rising electricity costs following a government hike in electricity tariffs, the first in 5 years. And this has been directly felt, for example, by auto component traders, with reports that prices have risen 40% and overall costs by 5 to 7%. But despite this, the industrial sector's indicated preparedness to absorb higher rates, given Myanmar's energy challenges, for example, an unreliable power supply, which makes advanced manufacturing extremely difficult, and the need for change, particularly if this results in a more stable provision of service. In 1995, the Myanmar government formed the Myanmar Industrial Development Committee, which established 18 industrial zones in 9 states and regions. And the MIDC was later renamed the Industrial Development Committee, and its primary role was promoting green and clean industries in collaboration with Myanmar's Chamber of Commerce and Industry and government committees with responsibility for the industrial zones. Today, there's around 60 industrial zones in Myanmar, 29 of which are in Yangon. There's also a number of special economic zones which are under development in Rakhine, and in the Yangon region and elsewhere. And SEZs are governed by the Special Economic Zone Law, which was enacted in 2011. The Yangon regional government is working to upgrade its industrial zones, given the lack of infrastructure, which has resulted in low levels of economic zone activity. And the industrial zones outside of Yangon also face difficulties in terms of poor transport links to highways and railways, and with many zones developed in the 1990s and 2000s, have continued to struggle to attract investment. Zones in the Irrawaddy region are, however, closer to seaports, and the government has indicated its intention to expand the number of zones in this region. Myanmar's SEZs, on the other hand, have secured significant institutional and financial support for development. In the 10 months to July 2019, Myanmar's SEZs attracted $1.72 billion in FDI, of which Singapore was the largest contributor, accounting for 37.5% of overall investment. The Tilawa SEZ is perhaps the most successful SEZ and currently employs around 10,000 people, has attracted over $1.6 billion in approved investment. And as of the middle of last year, more than half of the zone's developed area was occupied, having attracted more than 100 companies, 90 of which are foreign-owned, the majority of which are Japanese. Looking forward, the zone is pressing ahead with further development plans and aims to open a further 500,000 square meters this year. Tilawa's SEZ's success is attributable to its good transport links. The zone has its own river port and benefits from the river bridge nearby. That's not to say that the zone doesn't face challenges, and high labour turnover has been a problem. The regional government also plans to create new industrial zones and has formed an industrial zone management committee to verify whether companies granted land are actually using it, with the committee prepared to reclaim land that's not in use. This contrasts with the previous approach when land utilisation requirements were often not enforced. As of September last year, 40% of industrial zone plots in Yangon were undeveloped. So the new industrial zone law aims to facilitate growth in Myanmar's industrial sector against this background and establish consistent rules and regulations for industrial zones, create employment and improve economic growth. An industrial zone is land designated as an industrial zone by a government notice, according to the definition. And all new and existing zones will be monitored by the Regional Industrial Zones Development and Management Committee, which will also be responsible for submitting investment proposals, policies, industrial development programs, and reports to the Industries and Industrial Zone Development Central Committee for approval. So a developer wanting to establish an industrial zone is required to submit an investment proposal to the regional committee, which must comply with a certain breakdown of land use. You can see it's industrial area 60 to 70%, commercial area 1 to 5%, public utilities and assisting area 20 to 25%, and the green belt 9 to 10% of the overall. The regional committee will then submit a proposal specifying the size, type and level of industrial zone for approval by the central committee. Once an agreement has been entered into between the developer and the regional committee, the developer can establish an industrial zone business, sublease the land to investors and build infrastructure. Developers have to complete the work for each construction project within the industrial zone within a specified period. If there's no compelling reason for failing to accomplish the work, the permit will be revoked. Developers have to comply with all relevant laws on environmental conservation, workplace safety, healthcare and fire safety. Matters related to the bonded warehouse system within an industrial zone have to be carried out in accordance with Myanmar customs law and procedures. The new investment zone law allows certain activities to be conducted in an industrial zone: manufacturing finished products, related products, packaging products and value-added products, transporting and delivering raw materials and finished products, business relating to road maintenance and road upgrade, and trading of manufactured products. Much like the conditions imposed on developers, investors have to complete work on construction projects within the specified period, and failure to do this without a sufficiently compelling reason may result in revocation of the permit. Developers and investors can use industrial land for industrial manufacturing or related businesses for up to 50 years, with the possibility of 2 10-year extensions of land use rights with the approval of the regional committee. Projects that aren't completed within the specified project period are subject to a fine equivalent to 10% of the land value, and if payment of the fine isn't possible, the land use permit or grant will be revoked. Developers and investors are entitled to an exemption from income tax for specified periods depending on the zone's location. The Central Committee can also provide special incentive periods for certain investment activities through the issue of notifications, such as the establishment of industrial zones in less developed regions and investments in them, investments which create many job opportunities in regions with low employment rates, investments which are capable of exporting agricultural primary products as value-added products, for example, canned products, investments which manufacture certain agricultural machines and equipment, and export business of value-added products and the manufacture of innovative products. So the primary aim of the new industrial law is to promote economic growth and develop the industrial sector, but there are other developments relevant to the development of the industrial sector, which I'm also going to mention. In November last year, the Myanmar Parliament voted in favour of merging the Ministry of Industry and Planning, Ministry of Industry and Ministry of Planning and Finance to create a single government body dedicated to supporting the reform of state-owned enterprises through private investment. In August 2018, the Myanmar Companies Law came into force, allowing foreigners to own 35% of a Myanmar company. And as you may know, from March this year, foreign investors have been allowed to trade companies listed on the Yangon Stock Exchange. In November 2018, the government launched the Project Bank, prioritising projects in need of funding and making them available for a review on a transparent online database. The initiative aimed, among other things, to improve the allocation of development finance and private investment and promote public-private partnerships. Investment in the government's priority sectors are eligible for incentives such as exemption from income tax for up to 7 years, exemption from customs duties on non-domestically available materials, and 50-year land leases, which may be extended twice for 10 years. Promoted sectors include manufacturing, establishment of industrial zones, infrastructure, and renewables. Transport developments also have the potential to improve Myanmar's appeal for industrial investment owing to the logistics benefits. Transport developments include India's Adani Yangon Internal Terminal securing DICA approval in May last year to construct a $290 million port to handle an additional 800,000 20-foot equivalent unit containers. The Ministry of Transport and Communications has also been collaborating with the JICA to create a national logistics master plan to develop infrastructure capable of handling an expected 85% increase in cargo movements by 2030. The NLMP will include 167 project proposals designed to create an efficient logistics system, encouraging foreign investment and unlocking industrial and agricultural development. It's expected that foreign partnerships will facilitate further investment in Myanmar industries. Current examples are South Korea laying the groundwork for companies to invest more heavily in Myanmar, Myanmar's Urban and Housing Development Department signing a joint venture with Korea Land and Housing Corporation in August last year to develop the Korea-Myanmar Industrial Complex around 10 kilometers north of Yangon, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, which is being developed as part of China's Belt and Road, the Muse Economic Zone, the 2018 agreement with China for a deep sea port and SEZ in Rakhine State, and a US $400 million economic free zone on the outskirts of the capital of Kachin State, which is earmarked for development by China's Yunnan Tenchong Hanyong investment, with a follow-up agreement set to be signed in 2020. The 9-point agreement entered into between Myanmar and Thailand in October last year for the $8 billion Darway SEZ, which is set to be Southeast Asia's largest industrial complex. And finally, the signing of a framework agreement between the Ministry of Construction and Thailand's Amata Corporation in August 2019 to jointly develop a $1 billion smart ecosystem in Yangon, set to be the first industrial zone between Myanmar and Thailand. And that pretty much concludes my overview. But I just wanted to mention that this afternoon I was actually chatting with somebody from who actually was doing a PhD in Hong Kong. And in his final draft PhD thesis, his whole PhD is actually on SEZs. And his conclusion is that actually Myanmar is the brightest spot of many that they've looked at in relation to the future and the development of SEZs and industrial zones, mainly because now is the time in Myanmar's development history when this is likely to be extremely crucial, and they're likely, if they're managed properly, which we hope they will be with the new law, to experience exponential growth and attract more investment. So that's the end of my overview, and I'm really happy to take questions or to discuss with you any points that you would like to raise. I think you'll put them in the chat, and Adrian will talk to me about them, and I'll give my answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for a very comprehensive review of the new laws there. There's a lot of interesting things. If I could ask everybody to use the Q&A section of the call for any questions that you wish to raise. And we'll use that rather than the chat function so that Julie can see the questions as we come through. Okay, so lots of information that we've provided there on various other things. So for me, I would just like to maybe, whilst we wait for people to think about the Q&A, Julia, in your opinion, the new industrial zone law, how much do you think it will attract foreign investment, given the comprehensive nature of it?
Well, it definitely has the potential to attract foreign investors owing to the opportunities, particularly for long-term land use. And I think if that's coupled with a much more secure power supplies, that's going to be a huge thing. I know for Hong Kong investors, they've always been very concerned about intermittent power supply. And also, as I mentioned, the law provides special incentive periods for specified activities, which I was talking about. I think prior to the enactment of this law, there was no specific industrial zone law governing the construction of new industrial zones and upgrading existing zones, passing specific rules and regulations, and providing incentives would allow, when one would hope, would encourage them to invest more and perhaps make the whole picture more coherent and easier to market, so that we could be more confident that the enactment will bring about employment opportunities. And because of the new law and the authority governing it, there's more of a focus for investors to be able to deal with this authority and to communicate with them. And just, for example, this is the Myanmar-Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce, and I think it would, certainly from a Hong Kong perspective, and quite a lot of Chinese investment comes through Hong Kong. It's something which we should definitely be promoting in Hong Kong to Hong Kong investors who may be considering, and manufacturers may be considering, new locations. And it definitely gives us a very coherent package to be able to present and put forward, if all of these are much more clearly managed and they don't end up with fallow land in them and so on, which is very off-putting if new investors go and have a look, because they should be, under this new law, properly managed so that land would be reclaimed if it wasn't actually being used. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for a very comprehensive response on that particular point. We know that Myanmar does have quite a lot of land. Do you think that there'll be industrial zones will be able to, with the conditions that they've got and the number of additional industrial zones, do you think there will be too much capacity, or do you think it will be reasonably managed?
You know, I would hope there would be really a much more coherent policy. You know, particularly the apparently intended focus to perhaps increase the number around the Irrawaddy region. That would make perfect sense, because the industrial zones that are going to be the most popular, and this certainly is, you know, I've worked in industrial zones for the last 30 years in China. You know, the most attractive ones at the outset are the ones in the more prominent areas near good communications and with port and rail or road good access. So the fact that those would be focused on first, I think to some extent they definitely would be the ones that would be developing much more quickly. And then if Myanmar follows the trajectory which you've seen in other countries, like in particular the China model and to some extent India and so on, basically the less popular zones, which have to offer a lot more incentives in order to, and land and so on, and very good deals, which are probably much less attractive in the early days. As Myanmar's development trajectory increases and it becomes a much more industrialized economy, we will find that the less accessible places, well, firstly, the transport links will increase, but secondly, they will become more attractive because there will be more availability of labor in those places. It'll be cheaper for the workers to live there. It'll be cheaper to do business there. So that tends to be the trajectory of growth of industrial zones and SEZs. So right now, what I hear in Hong Kong is, oh, we all want to be in Yangon. We want to manufacture in Yangon. And I say, what about here? What about there? No, we want to be in Yangon. So I think, you know, Yangon, Irrawaddy, and from China, more in the Mandalay area. I mean, actually, one of our clients has what's effectively a business park, which could fall within one of these in that area. You know, those key areas are going to be the prominent ones probably for the next 5 years. But beyond that, I would see with a managed process rolling out the others as these ones fill up.
Yes, thank you for that. Just a reminder to everybody, Q&A session. We will be, if you have any questions, please do raise them. We've got a few minutes left of this webinar. So any burning questions, please do use that. But to be honest, Julie, it looks like you've been quite comprehensive in your review. So there's only a few questions, but we do have one coming in here. How ongoing industrial zone projects such as Korea Industrial Complex and Hatan Tabin Hong Kong developments, especially in terms of land utilisation, they might have already allocated industrial land and commercial land, which was made before this actual law was introduced. So I suppose the question is, how do they go about the formation of management committees, regional committees and central committees to potentially bring those facilities back within the new industrial zone law? I assume that's the point we made.
Zone law will cover that, so I think that will be within it. Yeah, so that it will cover it. I mean, the actual details of exactly how they're going to implement that, I'm not clear about. I don't think that's probably fully worked out yet, but I can certainly look into that further if people would like a direct answer on that.
Yeah, it would be interesting to understand. So I'm sure that it'll be. But the person raising the question has already said thank you. So I think they've already feel that you've been able to answer that.
If I hear more detail of the process, I'll let you know, and you can pass that on.
Yeah, excellent. One question that came up but just disappeared slightly there. And a question I would like to know: what's going to be the incentive of the industrial zone versus the special economic zone, and how do you see a differentiation between the two?
I think the special economic zones, which have been around for also a long time and which have had their own law for a while, they tend to be much more in conjunction with an outside investor, a large outside investor. So there's the Japanese one, there's the Thai one, and I think there's a China one. But the really successful one of those is the Japanese one. And that's stupendously successful. I mean, there's an awful lot of investment in that. And, as I mentioned, there's a majority of Japanese companies in that. So it's really a question of them falling within these different regulations. And I think for the one which is planned with China, I mean, it's interesting that actually Pakistan has got a series of special economic zones under the Belt and Road Initiative between China and Pakistan planned. So, that will tend to congregate lots of Chinese enterprises probably in that zone. And rather like the China experience when they had Singapore setting up an industrial zone in Suzhou, the SIP, that was all, that was largely, wasn't only, but it was very well managed by with Singaporean involvement, but it tended to attract a lot of Singapore businesses. So I think industrial zones generally tend to attract a wider cross-section of investors from different places, whereas each special economic zone with its own investment profile and focus tends to have its own characteristics, and it may be very suitable for certain kinds of investment or attractive to businesses from certain places in a way that industrial zones tend to be of a more general nature.
Thanks, Julia. We know that it's now 5 o'clock, so we've reached our allotted time. So as such, Julia, can I thank you very much for comprehensive answers and to the questions and for a very informative presentation. We will, of course, share that presentation to the media from the Myanmar-Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce, and all of that will be on there. If you weren't able to ask a question during this session or now think of questions post this session, please feel free to let us know through the Myanmar-Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce, and we'll endeavour to align answers back to you on these things. We do know that these laws are very, very new and very exciting, so we look forward to seeing how they will develop over time, and we'll probably get more answers the more they start to develop. So Julia, again, thank you very much for this and for your previous one. We will upload the presentation and all of the details, and so people can review, reflect, and think about any questions they may have. Just finally, before we go, as the Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce, we do have some upcoming events you may be interested in. One is the titled COVID-19, as they all are, Potential Implications for Business in Myanmar. So that is going to be conducted by Jerry Mullins, Country Director of Reens and Partners, to talk about the potential implications, which follows on nicely from this. And then we're looking to do a Outlook 2020 panel discussion in conjunction with the World Bank and a few other invited guests. Again, look out for that on our social media feeds, our website and everything else. So without further ado, I will thank you all for participating, for joining us on this call. Julia, once more, thank you, and to Charltons for a very comprehensive and informative session today. And I wish you the rest of you all a good day for the rest of the day. And if you need anything more from us, you know where to contact us and let us know what you want. Thank you all very much, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.